Hi, my name is Beatrice Brando, and I'm a research analyst at UC Berkeley in the Office of Planning and Analysis. Today, I'm going to present on my talk, Resources and Responsibilities, Disparity in Student Experiences during COVID-19. So to sort of provide a little bit of background and touch base on my abstract, as we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent switch to remote learning had a large impact on university students from around the world. And in particular, many students found themselves with more limited resources as well as additional responsibilities while still trying to keep up with their challenging coursework and adjust to remote learning. And unfortunately, these impacts were felt most strongly by marginalized groups as COVID-19 exacerbated existing inequalities. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about the results of the UC Undergraduate Experience Survey, or UQs, which is administered every 2 years to all undergraduate students in the UC system who are at least 18 years old. So in 2020, spring semester, we were planning to launch UQs, and it ended up including some additional items about COVID-19. So we, at our campus of UC Berkeley, invited all enrolled undergraduates during the spring semester. So that was 29,459 students. From that population, 44% responded to at least one of the items in the first block of questions, and 39% made it to the end of the survey and submitted it. So UQs is predominantly made up of core SIRU items, but in the spring 2020 administration, as I mentioned, we also included additional questions exploring students' experiences during COVID-19 pandemic. So the survey launched at the beginning of April, so we were launching just as all of the UC campuses went remote. So this talk is in particular going to explore the impacts of COVID-19 on undergrads at UC Berkeley, and in particular ways in which members of marginalized groups often found themselves with more limited resources and additional responsibilities during this time. So in particular, I'm going to talk about 3 areas. So student access to resources for learning, their assets, basic needs, and additional family care responsibilities. So when we think about resources for learning, there's a lot of different resources that students need for learning. But in UQs, we ended up talking about 2. Or in particular 2, and there's 2 that I'm going to focus on here. So in UQs, we asked students, how concerned are you about the possible effects of COVID-19 on your learning in the following ways? And 2 of the items were having access to an appropriate study space and having reliable access to the internet. So the first thing I'm going to point out here is that a lot of students were concerned about having access to an appropriate study space, and fewer were concerned about having reliable access to the internet, but a non-insignificant number of students reported being concerned. Having said that, these issues were felt most strongly by low-income students. So in this talk, I'm going to be focusing on Pell recipients as a sort of measure, a sort of way of capturing whether or not a student is low income. So for additional information, Pell grants are federal grants given to students from low income families. In this presentation, students were characterized as Pell recipients if they answered yes to the following UQs item, which asks, have you ever received a Pell grant? So as we can see here, 89% of Pell recipients reported having been somewhat to very concerned about having access to an appropriate study space, while only 76% of non-Pell recipients did so. It's even more striking if you look at the number that were very concerned. So we see that 49% of Pell recipients were very concerned about this, while only 26% of non-Pell recipients were. We also have a category here that is students who are unknown. These were students who didn't answer the question in the survey. So they answered other questions, but they didn't answer this one. And as you can see, they're sort of in between. So it's likely a mixture of the 2 populations. When we ask about having reliable access to the internet, again, we see that there's a bit of a disparity. So 69% of Pell recipients reported being somewhat to very concerned about having reliable access to the internet, while only 52% of non-Pell recipients did so. When we break it down by ethnicity, we also see that there are gaps. So a higher percentage of URM students reported being concerned about their study space. And this is particularly true for Chicanx, Latinx students, where 92% reported being concerned about this. A kind of quick note, so the survey response data was linked to campus administrative data, and then student ethnicity was based on the administrative data. Another kind of note is that many URM students on our campus are also Pell recipients, so some of the results we see here may be due at least in part to the intersection of these two populations on our campus. We also start seeing some disparities when we think about having reliable access to the internet. So again, a higher percentage of underrepresented minority students reported being concerned about having reliable access to the internet. This is particularly true for Pacific Islander respondents. Note that this is on our campus a rather small population. We had an N size of 26, but we are still seeing it for some of the kind of larger URM groups on our campus, including 71% of Chicanx Latinx students and 65% of African-American students reporting being somewhat to very concerned about having reliable access to the internet. The other thing that's really important to consider isn't just whether or not students during this time had access to learning resources, but whether or not they're able to meet their basic needs. So another item that we asked about in UQs was, how concerned are you about the possible effects of COVID-19 on you in the following ways, and in particular, meeting basic needs? So this consists of food, housing, et cetera. Again, so this is still an issue that many students were concerned about, but we do see that Pell recipient students reported on average, a higher rate of them reported being concerned about this. So we see that 79% of Pell recipients reported being somewhat to very concerned about this issue, compared to students as a whole, where only 58% of students were reporting being somewhat to very concerned about meeting basic needs, which is still higher than we'd like. Again, we see a disparity between underrepresented minority students and non-underrepresented minority students on our campus, with a larger percentage of URM students reporting concerns about meeting basic needs. So this is particularly true for our Chicanx Latinx students, where 75% of them reported being somewhat to very concerned about meeting basic needs, and 32% were very concerned about meeting basic needs. We are also seeing high rates of this amongst our Native American Alaska Native students with 70%, and African American students with 68%. So the other piece, besides whether or not students had access to the resources they needed, is what additional responsibilities do they have on their plate? And a big thing that many students found themselves having to do is take on additional family care responsibilities, as they were now at home, and they had siblings, they had older relatives, and they had to take on additional responsibilities. So we started by asking students, due to COVID-19, do you now have additional family care responsibilities? And we included caring for children and elders, et cetera, in that group. So 38% of undergraduates on our campus reporting having additional family care responsibilities. And that's not the majority of students, but that is a significant number of students that are now having additional responsibilities during an already stressful time. And again, there is disparity between low-income students and non-low-income students, where we're seeing that 51% of Pell recipients reported having additional family care responsibility, while only 30% of non-Pell recipients did so. Again, we see that a higher percentage of underrepresented minority students reported having additional family care responsibilities. Again, this is particularly true for Chicanx Latinx students, where 57% of them report having additional family care responsibilities, and African American students, where 53% do so. This is also, we start seeing some kind of breakdowns here based on gender lines. So 41% of female students reported having additional family care responsibility, while only 34% of male students did so. And this is a significant difference between these two populations, and sort of shows that we're seeing that kind of family care responsibilities seem to be falling on students based on traditional gender lines. So in conclusion, on our campus, we're seeing that a higher proportion of URM and Pell recipients were concerned about their learning resources and meeting their basic needs. And a higher proportion also reported having additional family care responsibilities in this time. In addition, women were more likely than men to have additional family care responsibilities in this time. So this is important information as we consider both how we respond to COVID-19 to help support our students during this time, and also as we now are exiting the COVID-19 pandemic, fingers crossed, and how we plan for the future. So for example, this kind of information can inform campus responses during COVID-19. I mean, I know at UC Berkeley, for example, we developed a laptop and Wi-Fi hotspot lending program to help students with more limited computer and internet resources. And our Basic Needs Center also developed a comprehensive list of resources for students that might not have their basic needs met during this time to sort of help support students and make sure that they weren't being, or try to limit some of the massive impacts of COVID-19 during this time. However, even as we leave COVID-19 and as we end the pandemic, it's also important to consider these impacts moving forward and sort of to ask ourselves, what types of responses will we need in the future to ensure that students' disparate experiences during COVID-19 don't end up dominating the rest of their academic careers? Thank you so much for listening to my talk. I hope it was helpful to you, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of the CERU conference. Thank you.